You dumb bastard.
So with the new show comes the same old headlines: the next Game of Thrones, the Game of Thrones replacement, the Game of Thrones killer, the same song and dance. This is nothing new, of course. Media outlets have been doing this for decades. Movies, shows, video games, it's all the same. I remember when Sons of Anarchy was called The Sopranos on motorcycles, or more recently, Sisu is John Wick but in World War II, or Dune is the next Star Trek or Lord of the Rings, and of course who can forget, Rings of Power is the next Game of Thrones. The Witcher is the next Game of Thrones. Avatar aims to please Game of Thrones fans. And so on, and so on. I mean, the media is going to do what the media is going to do. And headlines like this definitely grab attention, so it's never going to stop. And this is my honest reaction every time I see it.
Hey! Ain't nobody trying to hear that bullshit.
But since they're already drawing comparisons between Game of Thrones and Shogun, I figured hell, might as well use this opportunity to bitch about these types of articles and headlines, as well as talk about the show for a bit. But before I get into that, I do want to acknowledge that, yes, Game of Thrones has had an effect on TV, and with its rise in popularity, definitely came networks and studios funding very similar projects. How similar these are to Game of Thrones depends on the product itself, and I'm pretty certain some were just kind of riding the wave and try to get viewers by producing something similar, so I'm not going to pretend there aren't imitators out there, or shows that were funded just to try to grab the same market, because those definitely exist. Today in particular though, this isn't one of those shows. This comparison is so silly that it becomes laughable, and I want to talk about it, as well as some of the articles I've seen. I know to many this might not be a big deal, and I'm just wasting time complaining about a clickbait article, but I've seen this so much and I really just want to bitch, so let me have this, alright? Of course this article is from Screen Rant, just stirring the pot. Of course all these media outlets do this. CBR is another one. Does anyone else remember that article comparing Spider-Man No Way Home to Zack Snyder's Justice League? That shit was funny. Bro, I just realized this article was made before the show even premiered. It just keeps getting better. Okay, we're gonna take a look at this article, but before then, I just want to tell you why this comparison is dumb just on like a basic level. So we're gonna play a game. I'm gonna list all the things that are similar, then all the things that are different. Simple and easy. You can do this at home. Alright, so both are mature rated shows that have a very political story that focuses on scheming and plotting so that someone can seize power. And that's about it. Oh yeah, and they're both violent, and there's some nudity, and they curse, and they're both based off of novels, but yeah, that's about it. So just on a surface level, that's all they have in common. Very fascinating, I know. They're basically the same thing, right? But now let's just delve a little deeper so we can go over some of the differences. Well, for starters, Game of Thrones is a dark fantasy that has dragons, zombies, and magic, and Shogun is loosely based on true events, taking place in Japan in 1600. So it goes without saying there's no magic, zombies, dragons, or any other fantastical elements. So right off the bat, just vastly different in the world, setting, and lore. You know, considering one's real and one's completely fictional. Even if people want to say that the time periods or setting are similar, Game of Thrones pulls more from medieval Europe than anything, whereas Shogun takes place during the end of feudal era Japan. I mean, they have guns and shit, so even the settings aren't that close. It's like, I imagine people see a show that is historical or a period piece from like the 16th century or earlier and just think Game of Thrones. Man, we really didn't have to dig that deep to find out that these shows are more different than they are similar. And there's definitely more I could probably touch on, but it's really not necessary. But now, let's go ahead and check out this article and see what they have to say. Again, it's still hilarious to me that this was written before the show even premiered. In the first two paragraphs is just fluff going over the fact that Game of Thrones ended 5 years ago, and how there are other Game of Thrones related properties in the works, but no official release dates yet for them, and that's where Shogun comes in. And they broke this up into little sections for us. For the first part, explaining how they're similar, it's literally just one paragraph, and part of it just sounds really silly. I mean, they mention the same things I just did, you know, the political scheming and the violence, but then they say something like, this sounds stupid like this. Both series are set in relatively ancient time periods. Fucking what? Maybe I'm just being a stickler, but the 1600s wasn't ancient. Something like Spartacus takes place in ancient times. And also, again, Game of Thrones isn't real, but even still, Game of Thrones pulls from medieval times, not fucking ancient times. Yeah, it's a small thing, but it just annoyed me. So what I said earlier literally stands right here. They see a show based around the 16th or 17th century and go, oh, that's Game of Thrones. And to close off this little comparison section of how they're similar, it says something just also really dumb. The various characters are also reportedly fully fleshed out and well acted, indicating that a Game of Thrones-esque ensemble could be in the making with the robust cast of Shogun. What does that even mean? Oh yeah, this show has some very well acted, very fleshed out characters. Game of Thrones also has some very well acted and fleshed out characters. You see what I mean when I say I can't take these articles seriously? They're just grasping at fucking nothing. And for the section that mentions how they're different, it just mentions the setting and time period, which is kind of funny because in the previous section, they compare the time period saying it takes place in relatively ancient times. So it's both similar and different, I guess. And that's literally all it mentions for the differences. Just some top-notch journalism, by the way. Now, what's just funny to me is that it has a little section right here that says, being the new Game of Thrones has hurt multiple TV shows. And in it, they basically mention how other shows have been compared to Game of Thrones but failed to live up to the expectations. But this time, it's different because Shogun is really good, at least according to reviews, because again, this was written before the show even came out. Okay, so obviously this article is pretty trash, but it gets even better, so check this shit out. So not long after this article was posted, and many others started saying the same thing over and over again, that this is the next Game of Thrones, or it's very similar to Game of Thrones, the actors and showrunners came out and basically said, nah, that's not true. I mean, here's some quotes you can check out and read, but it basically boils down to them saying, no, it's not like Game of Thrones. It's funny seeing Screen Rant cover this. It's like they're the ones that put out this narrative, and then when it's disproven, they cover the fact that it was disproven, even though they were the ones that were stirring it up in the first place. Like here, check this out. In one of the articles, it just says, the shows are broadly similar, but they're actually very different. It's like you were the ones saying that they're fucking similar in the first place, putting it in everybody's head. This shit just blows my mind. What is going on?
You need to be locked up! Away from decent, normal people!
Yeah, articles like this clearly suck, and are just here to stir the pot and drum up attention. I mean, I guess it worked because here I am talking about it. But now let's move on from the article and talk about the side effects something like this has. And the biggest thing is that it creates an unfair expectation for the show. I actually saw someone else point this out too. When you make comparisons like this, people will have it in their heads that these things are actually pretty similar, and when they're watching, they're going to be comparing it to it. And it's really not fair to the show because now it has to live up to expectations that it never set. Unless, of course, the showrunners themselves make these comparisons, and that's just kind of stupid. Now, it's fair to have like an expectation or comparison to something like House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones, because it literally takes place in the same world, it's produced by the same studio, and it's adapting works from the same author. So it makes sense to compare those two. Like how it's also fair to compare Rings of Power and the Lord of the Rings movies. Both are set in the same world based on the writings from the same author. But of course, articles like these are just clear examples of them not really caring about things like that, and just comparing them for the sake of headlines. Another recent example would be when Dune released back in 2021. It was getting called the next Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, by reviewers and journalists. Of course, this was used for marketing material for the trailers, but because of this, there were people who had it in their heads that they would get something similar to the two previously mentioned IPs, and then they were left either confused or disappointed because they weren't that similar at all. Hell, as of recording this, Dune 2 is getting compared to the fucking Star Wars prequels of all things. Why? I don't really know. So really what happens is, whenever something becomes very popular and successful, the media kind of uses it as like a benchmark, mainly so that headlines look better. Kind of like how every DC movie gets compared to The Dark Knight. You know what I mean. The best DC movie since The Dark Knight type of headlines. That shit was annoying, and I guarantee in a few years we're going to be seeing them again. And for TV and shows in particular, they used to get compared to The Sopranos and The Wire, but now it's more so Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones. I mean, I guess that's about all I have to say. I just want to rant for a bit because I'm just annoyed with these headlines, but believe me, I know they aren't going anywhere, and they will continue to exist until a full-on media collapse happens. And I guess I'll end the video like this. Go watch Shogun. It's good, you won't regret it.
Alright! This one's going into my cringe compilation.
Last chance to look at me, actor.